Of course, how many of you use Zoom? Okay, good. How many of you use Canva? All right, how many of you have silicon in your devices from TSMC? And all of you do, but you probably don't know that. Anyway, so I'm going to touch on some of those companies, but I think recently, this is probably what I'm known for recently, although I've been doing venture now for over 3 decades. But it wasn't until I started touching consumer products that people figured out that I was, okay at what I did. These are some companies that I have coming up. Lineage Logistics should go public probably in July, August. And I think it's targeted to come out at about 30 billion, so it's a pretty good market cap. This is a list that CNBC makes of top 50 disruptive companies. So this list is 2 years old, but I was lucky to have a couple companies in the top 10. How did I get there? So this is me in my early 20s, or maybe my late teens, early 20s. Like a lot of people in the Valley, I was a kind of an introverted, nerdly little engineer that liked to work on stuff in basements in my back room and didn't like to talk to people. And I was forced to talk to people when I went to grad school because I ended up going to business school. But I think for the first 20 years of my life, I hardly talked to anybody. Anyway, and so when I got out of college, I came in search of other people like me. And when I was a kid, my dad had bought me this Radio Shack. Some of you are probably so young you don't even know what Radio Shack is. And so Radio Shack is it's a brand of a company that was actually headquartered down in Texas called Tandy Corp. And they had these retail stores where you could basically buy resistors and capacitors and vacuum tubes and oscilloscopes, literally all kinds of parts. And my dad bought me this little project kit when I was 9 years old. It was a Radio Shack 100-in-1 electronic projects kit. And it had parts on a piece of cardboard with a bunch of springs and a book. And you would basically follow the book, which had very basic instructions like take a wire and connect spring 4 to spring 16 and 17 to something else. And bam, you had a transistor radio. So I did a bunch of little projects when I was a kid, and then somehow when I was a teenager, I heard about this, I guess you'd call it a movement now, that was called phone phreaking. And it's fun for you guys to look it up, but if you look up phone phreaking, and in particular an article called Secrets of the Little Blue Box. So somehow, I think it came out in 1972 or something. Somehow I read that article, and I just had to find out how to make one of these things. The article, Secrets of the Little Blue Box, chronicles the first company that Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak had, which did not make computers. So what phone phreaking was, the US telephone system basically is a set of switches that have a carrier frequency at 2600 hertz. And if you make a little tone generator that generates at 2600 hertz, and I haven't tried this in a long time because payphones kind of went away, but at the time, if you dialed an 800 number call and you got other people to come on and then they hung up and you played that tone in right at the right time, you could control the telephone system and make free phone calls anywhere. And so I don't know why I wanted to do this because I had no one to call, but I just wanted to see how it would work, and these other kids had done it. They ended up getting arrested because, as it turned out, it was illegal. So they decided that it wasn't a good thing to keep going with that business, and they should start a computer company, and that became Apple. But anyway, because I had heard about that whole thing, I came out to Silicon Valley in the 80s in search of the Homebrew Computer Club. And like the talk I had with Philip this morning, there are all these moments that happen in life that you have no idea what's going to play out. And there are some moments that become historic, but you don't know at the time that they might become historic. So this group of people included at various times, they weren't all there, there were probably times when they were all there at one time, but the people that would come to these meetups were Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, Bill Gates, Paul Allen, the people that started Sun Microsystems, Alan Shugart that started Seagate, Nolan Bushnell was a regular that started Chuck E. Cheese, and Atari and Malibu Fun Center, if you ever drove the go-karts around. Anyway, so lots of historic moments, but you would have never known it at the time. And I wasn't there when Wozniak came with a piece of wood with parts on it, but his first computer, the Apple computer, probably seen pictures of it, it literally was a piece of wood with parts on it. And people would bring things to these community meetups to get feedback on what they should do next. So much like what became open source movements. Anyway, so that led me, I had to find a job. So I joined a guy named Wilf Corrigan in a startup from something called LSI Logic. And another set of historic movements really in the making that I had no idea what train I was on. So you've probably heard the legend of Fairchild Semiconductor, but there was a guy named Charlie Sprague out on the East Coast that had funded Sherman Fairchild and Shockley. Shockley Semiconductor, the management team blew up. They started Fairchild. And somehow the Fairchild management team, which was intellectually very bright, a lot of like PhD physicists working on semiconductor physics, they all split up and ended up starting Intel and National Semiconductor, AMD. The CEO started LSI Logic. Jensen Huang and I joined him. So Jensen, who now runs NVIDIA, who I'm related to, he was, we're all from Kaohsiung, Taiwan of all places, but Jensen and so many other interesting people were in these companies, but at the time, they're just like anyone in this room. You would never know that all these great things would be made by these people. Kleiner Perkins, so Eugene Kleiner started Kleiner Perkins out of that. Don Valentine was the sales guy at National Semiconductor. He ended up starting Sequoia Capital. And Tom Perkins and Don Valentine and a guy named Reed Dennis ended up funding us at LSI Logic. And when I went into the venture business, I tagged along with Don when Sequoia was it was still kind of a one-man, it's never really a one-man show. It was him and Pierre Lamond, but it was basically two guys. Anyway, so that ultimately led to this. So in 1987, the government of Taiwan decided that they wanted to get into the semiconductor business. And another moment where, looking back, I really had no clue that this would go on to become the 8th most valuable company in the world. The Japanese had entered the semiconductor business. There was overcapacity everywhere. The US guys were laying everybody off. National Semiconductor had the biggest layoff in the history of Silicon Valley. And here's little Taiwan that wants to get into the business when the Japanese are crushing them. And I think just because I happened to be of Taiwanese origin, and I had experience in the semiconductor business, I was willing to go back there when no one else would even consider it, because I wanted to work on my Chinese language. So I took Chinese lessons in the morning, and I wrote characters in the morning, and I worked on a plan to build TSMC. And I helped create a spreadsheet that became Fab 1, a 60,000 wafer start, 5-inch wafer size factory throughput models, and that got built, and that became this. That market cap's old, so I think it's now about 800 billion, something like that. Anyway, so that led later, I had all these relationships in the government because TSMC kind of started working. So when the internet hit, there was how many of you remember a company called UUNet? Yeah, so the people that, so in the early 90s, there were 3 or 4 really big ISPs. There was, I think, Netcom, PSINet, UUNet. There had another one too, because I did a bake-off with those 4 because I thought, well, this internet's going to be a big thing, maybe, because it wasn't for sure. And I was like, I could probably set up a little ISP in Asia and do like an interconnect thing. So John Sidgmore, if you remember him, he was the CEO of UUNet. I ran into that company when it was $1 million a month in revenue, losing money, and John wrote me a check for $500,000, and I bought 4 Cisco 500 routers, 2,500 routers, flew them out to Taiwan, and got the Ministry of Communications to let me put them in Taiwan, Taipei, Hsinchu, or Taipei, or what, there were 4 nodes. I bought a half circuit to the USA and started an ISP, and that became 10 data centers. So around 2000, Goldman, Morgan, and Solomon took that public, and that's when I met Philip, or right just before that, met Philip, who started Second Life. We were on a panel together, so we'll touch on that a little bit later. And anyway, so that went public, and I retired, started kitesurfing, became a sponsored athlete. But anyway, so the point of all this is the world is a really noisy place, and there's a lot going on. And I think it's just really important to be sensorily aware of stuff that's going on and to kind of like listen to those vibrations, because I think people they let themselves get too cluttered with too much thinking, too much logic, too many projects, too much stuff going on. And I found that if you just sort of let all that stuff go and just work on a few things, that eventually some things are going to work out. So, whoa, I'm going to shorten this because I know we're late. Yes, there's some more of my companies. There's some fun stories. Some things that are happening in venture now are quite amazing. So the world obviously has gotten to be a very international market, and there were, for a long, long time, guys like Don Valentine, who started Sequoia, would say never, and he told me this, never fund anything more than an hour away from your office, when people used to go to offices. And there was an era where that mattered a lot, because there was so much innovation happening in Silicon Valley that it was, all the market cap was really market capitalization of companies. The growth in market cap was really just happening in the Valley. And I guess to some extent that's true today too, because if you look at NASDAQ and the growth of Meta and NVIDIA and Google and all that, unless they were refugees that left the Valley to move to a tax-free state like Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates, because they started their stuff in the Valley, all of that was coming out of California, Northern Cal, like a 100-mile radius was the bulk of the market value being created for many years. But I think this industry, crypto in particular, has become a very international market. And as waves of technology have passed by, it's been interesting to see in the crypto space, none of the companies, actually only one of the companies I funded was in the Valley, and probably 80% of them are outside. And even the one I helped fund in the Valley, you guys moved to Seattle and Minnesota. So you can really do this thanks to Zoom and other things, you can do this from anywhere. This is kind of a fun story. In speaking of waves, so I am compressing the talk a bit, but if we think about where we are today in the kind of this moment in history that is going to be defining, the things that have been waves to invest in, and there's a lot to be said for timing. So I'm going to ramble here a little bit, but when I talk about what makes for a good investment, there's three things that really matter. And this, by the way, is something I learned from Don Valentine. So when I started in venture, one of the first investments I worked on was a company called Microchip. And like TSMC, I will bet 100% of the people in this room use products from Microchip, and you don't even know it. Ticker symbol is MCHP. But they make little microcontrollers that are in car engines, remote controls, microwave ovens, things like that. And this company happened to be in Phoenix, Arizona. There was a time we had a board meeting, and after the board meeting, our flight back was canceled. So I was stuck at a dinner with Don, and I asked Don, I said, and I was just starting the business, so I said, so Don, I guess you're pretty good at this business, and by the way, how good is this guy? So here's a guy that was a salesman at National Semiconductor. He ended up funding Apple, Cisco, Oracle, LSI Logic, our company, Electronic Arts, Network Appliance, and I think, and not that many, so probably on, 1.5 hands, you could count $1 trillion of exits with just, like one investment every couple years. So shot selection really matters. Warren Buffett's like that too, right? They don't do very many things. And so Don basically said to me, he said, and if you know the legend of Don, he's very terse. He doesn't say very much. And he said to me, there's really only three things you got to get right: markets, management, capital. He said, you got to be in a very big market. You got to do it at the right time. And then now the people thing has changed a lot, because in that day, most of the companies were pretty asset heavy. You'd build, you'd buy semiconductor fab equipment or just a lot of gear. He said, and the people, he said, you got to pick the right people. So you just swap them in and out until it works, which is very different than today, where you're really backing an entrepreneur. And the third was, get rid of financing risk. So don't overpay, and don't be in a business that's going to just, suck capital away. And it took me a long time to really internalize that, but the more and more I stuck to that model over time, and the fewer things I did, the better results I had. And so the adage of don't fund anything an hour away from your office, that stuck with me for a long time. But when the internet started to happen and the more modern waves started to bring technology knowledge everywhere to the world, it started to disperse a little bit. And this is just a fun story. This is in the waves again. So we started with silicon, and then I funded a lot of silicon companies, and then I moved up the stack to fund things made out of silicon. So add-in cards, computer companies, communications gear, and then the network layer, which was the internet. And then there was a pause until Web 2.0. And then I started to fund interface companies like Twitter and TweetDeck and things like that. And then that whole infrastructure changed to mobile and cloud. And then the companies that won in that interface era were the people that understood their data. So about 12 years ago, I think 2011, from 9, 10, 11, I was looking for something in machine learning, big data. And this kid comes into my office. Except he was referred to me. One of my prior investors said, I met this kid who reminds me of a CTO of one of your companies. But he works on this thing that I don't understand called Hadoop. And if you understand Hadoop, it's a distributed database architecture. And that perked my ears up. So I said, whoa, what does he do? And he said, well, he was the founder, I guess, of the world's largest Hadoop user group. And I said, well, fly him in. So this kid comes in from Tokyo with another guy named Yoshikawa, who spoke English. And he started presenting. And I asked him to draw me a Hadoop cluster. I said, I want to see, if you're going to build a Hadoop cluster, show me what you'll build. So he goes up there and he draws this thing. And in 15 minutes, I knew it was a fit. So there was a big market I saw coming, the right time. And here is a piece of talent that I thought, this guy, I don't know what we're going to do with, but I know we can build it. And I committed to fund him in 15 minutes. And he didn't understand English. So he just kept presenting. And then he walks out of the room, and I guess he asked his co-founder coming out of the meeting, he said, how did that go, Hiro? And Hiro said, oh, you didn't hear, he wrote a check. He's funding our company. He's starting a company with us. And Kaz, because he had gotten turned down in Japan by dozens of people, he said to Hiro, America's great. Anyway, so that was the start of Treasure Data. And that eventually, we got the company up and running, did pretty well. It got acquired by SoftBank for about $700 million. And so other fun stories. So that is Melanie Perkins, who I met on a kiteboarding trip. And there was a time when I went out to Perth. How many of you have been to Australia? You are, okay. And how many of you have been to Perth other than her? Wow, that's actually, percentage-wise, that's actually over-representation. Because, I would say 90% of the people I meet in Sydney have never been to Perth. Okay, now, so to get to Perth from California, you have to fly about 16 hours first to Singapore. And then you've got like a 4-hour layover, and then you got to fly another 6 hours to get to the far western corner of that country. In Australia, the landmass is about the size of the continental USA. There's only about 27 million people there, and almost all of them live on the East Coast. So in that little, I think in the western half, there's only about 3 million people. So it's beautiful, it's untouched, the water, turquoise, the sand is white, it's just a wonderful place. But there's no one that lives there. And so I go on this kiteboarding trip, And I meet this 23-year-old gal making high school yearbooks in her mom's living room. And she describes to me the problems she's having because she wanted a better drag and drop interface to collate, content. And she said, if I want to start a company that will do this. And she was teaching Adobe classes. So right at that time, I had made this transition in my investing philosophy to everything is going to be cloud and mobile. And I think it was obvious to quite a few people, but the iPhone had been out for a couple of years, and you could just see a significant change in the cost structure of delivering anything. And again, so markets, size, and timing. It looked like it was going to be a pretty seismic shift. And this is when I started to fund these cloud, like Treasure Data was a cloud Hadoop company, Zoom was cloud video, this was cloud design effectively. And no one thought that you could start a company in tech in this little seemingly backward corner of Australia, but for some reason, I decided to fund her. And I think many of you use this product now, but the company is now doing about $200 million a month in revenue. It's about a 70% gross margin, 30% pre-tax, profitable for 7 years. The company's worth about $28 billion. So Don's don't fund anything an hour away from your office is no longer true. The world's kind of a worldwide place. This story, I think people know this one, but yeah, similar thing. The video markets had been stale for a long, long time. And often the best investments, oddly, are the ones that no one else will fund. I think it took me it was probably 3 years from the time I met Melanie to the time we completed a seed round. And it was a rolling seed. It was a very, very hard raise. And same with Zoom. When I funded Zoom, I think it took us 2 years to finish the seed because after the first check, even though I had had pretty good success by that time, every single one of my traditional venture friends turned down funding Zoom. And I guess in some ways, looking back, I should have understood that they would have, but the common feedback was, are you fucking kidding me? You're competing with Microsoft and they have infinite capital and their product's free. Bill, do you know that? And same with Google with Hangouts. So it was really, really difficult to get that raise done. But it worked. Anyway, okay, just being aware. So, and Philip knows this date because I sent Philip a note on this date. I showed him the email this morning. We have to look at Bitcoin for Second Life. And so this was the day that I went all in, which was Thanksgiving weekend. On holidays, I sometimes I build these kinds of things. I do little projects, and that was the weekend, because I had an extra day on the weekend, and I downloaded the software from bitcoin.org and started playing with it, and I was like, oh, this is going to be a real thing. Anyway, so that turned into a project to build what turned out to be a little data center. So our dining room was a data center for a little while. If you haven't seen it, whoa, I can't turn the volume off on it. Anyway, so that's just an example. That's a data center from about 2014, I think. So that's a 10 million watt data center. After I started using the software, I decided it might be easier to not do it at home because electricity, by the way. So now, if you're working with Bitcoin mining today, you really need to get electricity that's kind of like 3 cents a kilowatt hour, and you need to be able to get it at 100 to 200 megawatts or more at a time. This data center, I think, was 10 million watts at 6 cents. And my little operation in Menlo Park, rates vary in California depending on time of day and all that. It was 24 cents a kilowatt hour at peak. So, and you could actually make, you could make Bitcoin, it might look like it was break even then, but if you held it, eventually it more than covered the electricity cost. But another example of just being aware of waves and things that might happen and just committing and just trying. A lot of life is just the effort. You just got to try. Actually, so that I condensed it pretty fast. Actually, I'm going to go into MetaGood a little bit because Amanda talked about it. But one of the things that after I started to work on crypto-related stuff, and she knows this story, but I had I was already kind of up and running with a company called Bitfury, and and I think I funded them around 2012. But in 2014, Vitalik came to pitch at the Stanford Bitcoin Meetup group run by Danny Yang, who's now CEO of MetaGood. And Vitalik was raising money for what would become Ethereum. And it was a fascinating meeting because, at the time, I'm guessing he was 19 years old. And if you think he's awkward now, imagine what he was like at 19 and a lot younger. And here I am feeling like, I'm king of this Bitcoin thing. And he comes up to me and he says, I'm going to make something that's better than Bitcoin. I'm like, oh, how are you going to do that? He said, well, it's pretty straightforward. There's 3 problems I'm going to fix. And I'm paraphrasing a bit because I don't remember the exact conversation. And he said, Bitcoin, it's too hard to use. So I'm going to make it easier. And I was like, yeah, that makes sense. Okay, but I didn't know how he's going to do that. And then God, what was the second thing? Oh, and he said, and that block time, nobody wants to go into a 7-Eleven and buy a can of soda and wait 9 minutes and 59 seconds to check out. I said, yeah, he's right about that. And I said, well, what are you going to do about that? And he said, my block time is going to be 10 seconds. And when I heard that, my mind kind of shut off, because if you've worked on distributed networks, the Bitcoin blockchain with a 10-minute period for everything to settle, that's all, it's not infinite time, but it's going to work. But to try to get a very, very distributed network to all agree in 10 seconds, I thought that was going to be impossible. And Philip and I were working on peer-to-peer networks in 1999. So I had been thinking about that for almost a decade by the time. So I was like, this kid, he's bright, but he's naive. Okay, and then I was like, okay, maybe he's going to have shorter than 10 minutes, but he's never going to hit 10 seconds. And then the last thing that he said was, and I think, this whole Bitcoin thing, it's too concentrated. I'm going to make it so guys like you that know silicon can't dominate the network. I was like, oh, how are you going to do that? He said, and if you know the Bitcoin algorithm, there's a little number called a nonsensical number that goes into the equation, comes out the other side. The math is very long, the variable is very short. And if you have a long math expression, there are ways, if you know how to use silicon, to express that in hardware, which is what a math coprocessor is, or what a GPU is, for example, where you can hardwire the math problem and make it just happen in one click. And so he said, well, I'm going to make mine so that instead of a little number and a big math problem, it's a big number and a small math problem. So there's never an incentive to make an ASIC, and everybody can use the same GPU, so everyone's equal. And I was like, oh, that's noble. I thought that was kind of cool, but I passed. Anyway, so it was fascinating to see after Ethereum launched. At the launch, and by the way, we set up 13 machines on Necker Island to run the test network for Ethereum in January 2015, 6 months before Ethereum launched. So we knew how to use it, we knew it would run, but anyway, I didn't go with it. But after it launched, you guys might remember it had to get rolled back. Because the higher layer languages have, they introduce places where you can attack it. So I thought it was going to be insecure, and it was. But that got fixed too. And the periodicity, I think, anyone know what the period time is now? Is it 13 seconds? I think a year ago it got down to, two years ago it was down to 13 seconds. So he's getting closer and closer. But anyway, so after Ethereum started to go, because initially the ICO went down, I think 70%, 40%. And I was like, I was right, but I wasn't right. So when it started to go, I shifted gears and decided, you know what? One of the world's worst networking protocols is TCP/IP. And there were so many different things in the early 90s and late 80s. There were just so many, token ring from IBM, there were CDDI, FDI, there's many networking technologies that were far cleaner, far more efficient than what became the world standard. And I thought, you know, the best technology, like the PC, the Mac was always better. The 68,000 was better than the x86. The Mac was better than the PC, but the PC won. I was like, well, you know, there's enough developers banging on this Ethereum stuff that maybe it becomes the standard. So I decided to fund a bunch of things in that space. And, but I didn't want to fund stuff in the USA because I knew the regulatory issues were going to come. So I funded Power Ledger in Australia, Dapper Labs in Canada, and I did make one investment in that era that I thought would be under the air cover of other people that would get arrested before me. And that was Joe Lubin and Mike Novogratz, and together we funded a company called Fluidity that launched the world's very first DEX. That was quite early. We were too early. But all those projects have worked out okay. The Dapper Labs story is a fun one. How are we doing on time? The Dapper Labs story, and I think she talked about that a bit, but when I funded Dapper, I wanted to see a more useful use case for crypto things than just spinning shit around and trying to, you know, fool other people and make money off them. So I asked the Dapper team, I said, look, I'm going to fund you, but I need you to do something for me, and I want you to make a special edition CryptoKitty that I can auction off at an ocean conservation gala. And they produced this thing, which is called HanuKitty. We sold this, I think for $50K, I can't remember now, and we gave the money to Captain Paul Watson and got him to park his ship off the island of Antigua and have people walk the beaches and protect the turtles so that all the baby turtles got off. So there was actually a real use case for social good. And did you tell this story when I was out?
I just briefly tell.
Yeah, so one of the things we did at MetaGood is we always wanted, conceptually, like there's, you know, a genesis block and a chain of things on any blockchain. We wanted this to be kind of the root of good, so the people could do different good things that would add to this chain. And while people use the asset and buy and sell and trade the assets, a little portion goes off into a pool. And how much money's in the DAO now?
It started in 2008, so 7 million.
7 million.
Today's
Okay, so we've ended up accumulating about $7 million worth of capital that the members that own the on-chain monkeys, they can nominate projects, and there's a little group that decides to then allocate capital. And among other things, when America pulled out of Afghanistan, the Afghan girl and her family were at risk because they're kind of a Western icon. So the funding from that DAO paid for the little secret paramilitary operation or whatever it was to evacuate her and her family and get them out of Afghanistan. And the pool has gone on to fund all kinds of things. The restoration of skate parks in Brazil, you know, it's kind of whatever the members want to do. So I think there's a kind of an economy of good karma, economy of good. So I think, do we have time for questions? Manana?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, you tell me what time we got to cut off. It's 4:46. Question there.
What's the one thing you are most excited about for right now?
There's never just one thing, but I would say I'm always excited about the projects I'm working on. You know, I'm going to be biased, of course, but I'd say the two that have they all have my attention. They're like kids, like your companies you put together like kids. They're all different. They're all at different stages. You love them equally, but at different times you got to focus on different ones. And the two that I think are grabbing most of my time right now, I took the CTO and part of his team out of Cambridge Analytica if you remember that, which high-flying, very good data scientists. The application of their technology, some would argue, is a little nefarious and swung the election to a way that, you know, I don't myself like, but didn't like at the time. But they were very good at what they did. So I basically took them out of there and put up some money to point them at something good. And so that team now is focused on making healthcare more efficient by driving the data layer, by doing things to the data layer. So they're a semantic AI company. They literally just, it's been a 3-year project. The company just launched at the world's largest healthcare information conference called HIMSS. And it was launched with Amazon Health Lake. Amazon's got a new data services thing they're trying to get healthcare providers on. And with Infor, which operates something called Cloverleaf, which is the world's #1 healthcare ERP backend. And so the medical system, particularly in America, it's pretty messed up, and the incentive systems are awful. Medical stuff right now is 18% of GDP. So literally $1 out of $5 spent in the entire American economy is going to healthcare shit. And my older sister's a doctor. The incentive structure is just crazy. When she first got out of medical school, she worked in private practice, and it was, you know, it was nice. Good patient relationships, and they cared about the patients, wanted good outcomes. And her practice got bought by an HMO and PPO, HMO. So you end up having these business groups buy the doctors and turn them into factories. And so it got to a point where she was incentivized or measured on how many people she could get in and out the door a day and how many things she could make the patients buy: drugs, procedures, tests, right? So there's this incredible overhead now and this insurance system that just dominates the economics of America. And there's so many things that make this country look like they're gonna go broke, and healthcare is one of them. So the Affordable Care Act does have some provisions in it to move the nation's healthcare system to what's called value-based care. So healthcare providers will by 2030, and it gets phased in, they will receive bonuses if the patients do not come back. Not that they're kicked out, but if they get better, right? So the semantic AI layer that these guys have built allows a doctor, when they take their, whatever they do with the patient, they document it, it gets digitized, sucked into a system, and then a variety of recommended treatments comes out along with information about how effective they were for different variants of those trees. So, you know, we'll see how it goes, but that one's one. And there's another project I started around Zoom that we're shifting the back end a bit to open source, but it's called Gigaverse. And this one's just a fun one because I put it together with Matt Sorum of Guns N' Roses and Jerry Steinberg that launched ESPN and Fox Sports, and a talent agent that handles, you know, everybody from TikTok stars to like, you know, Goldie Hawn and Kurt Russell. And it's basically an instant live broadcast community tool. So think of it as sort of like Discord, an AI-assisted Discord with video. And it's a bit of an experiment, but it's going to be a fun one. Other questions?
What are some of the lessons you learned from your founders? So you've been on a few, you invested so many.
Yeah.
Some of the top lessons.
You know, I will work with all kinds of founders that have ranged from, like in my early days, the prototypical founder, if there was one, in the kind of the early 90s until the internet really started to hit, was somebody that from a product perspective had worked on 3 or 4 generations of X. You know, might have been like a router or a WAN access gateway or something, because markets were moving and they were very technically narrow and sophisticated, and everything was a price performance game. So you really had to know what the competitive landscape was and apply capital to come up with a product that was faster, higher performance at a little bit less price, and just kind of like replace successive generations. And then I think when when the internet got overbuilt for a while and there was so much excess capacity that kids like Mark Zuckerberg could start something in their dorm room, total change. And it was basically people that were solving a problem for themselves and just totally dedicated. And then I think as those markets matured, it's kind of a mix of both of those. But I think until, I guess, relatively recently, so the velocity of startups, of people starting companies, has gone like this. In the early 90s, it was pretty scary to start a startup because, you'd quit a high-paying job at a, IBM or a big company, and you probably had to raise, and this is in like early 90s dollars, $100 to $200 million or more. I had some companies doing silicon stuff, or microprocessor level stuff, that had to raise $700 million and carry a burn rate of $7 million a month for 7 years before they shipped a product. That was Transmeta. So stepping out of a salary job to go into something where you're going to have a few hundred people burning $7 million a month for years and having to go out and ask for money every 18 months, pretty scary. So I think as things shifted to, web children that could sit in their dorm room for free and then launch a product for literally nothing, and then the seed checks would be $100,000, totally different game. And so I think depending on the environment, you want a different kind of founder. And I think I've had a lot better luck, if you call it that, with funding second-time founders that have failed. Because I think what ends up happening is, or you want somebody that, you can never really model this, but if you can find somebody that got on a ramp, had a near success, didn't quite get there, and then lost it, but is willing to come back, like Richard at Fathom, that's a perfect example, or Nancy, that kind of person. Someone else paid their tuition on all the mistakes and all the wasted money doing stupid things. So they're far more efficient. And Melanie, by the way, Perkins, in a way was a second-time founder because she tried to build something called Fusion Books and raised a little bit of money, didn't get spent real wisely on French contractors to build a drag-and-drop interface for content. That was Fusion Books to make her yearbooks. But she managed to get that to be break even by selling yearbooks, And I remember when I a little after I funded her, I told her, I said, Melanie, almost every company that I've had that exited up until that point, even if they got to be public companies, because a lot of companies in the 90s got public without being profitable. I said, almost every company that I've had that's made it has never been profitable. I said, at least you know how to make ends meet. And Canva manages to get profitable on about $37 million. So I think I like working with people that have had to bust their pick. Lynn's like that. You learned the hard way too before. So it's very helpful. Question there?
What advice do you have for a new fund that's to start to play capital to Web3? And are there any techniques to help improve the batting average?
Boy, that's a hard one too. I think a lot of it really depends on network. Okay, so I'd say different firms operate different ways, and it also is very stage dependent. And I'd say, for example, I think a Sequoia, they're very good at what they do because they're so embedded in the Valley now. And every time they have a company that hits, they convince the founder to put some money into the next fund. They have like a little side fund. So they're like the center of an information spider web with an ability to also recruit. And so I think, companies are basically piles of people. And so to the extent that you can get A players and assemble talent and get a good, values and culture matter in companies, that I've never had a company that had really cohesive culture and values not work to some extent. So I think focusing on leaders that can do that matters. And I think carving out your own network, whatever that is. And, who knows why my kiteboarding network worked, but it worked, So I think having something that unifies people around a set of values or an ethos, I think helps. There's a question back there?
Do you think the evolution of hardware used for inference or pre-training kind of followed a pattern that Bitcoin did, where it went from like general purpose CPUs to FPGAs to ASICs, and might kind of see the direction of the hardware?
I do. I exactly believe what you just said. In some ways, the training stuff, it's a little bit like the old CPU, like a general purpose CPU. It does a lot of things well, but there's some things that's dedicated things are going to do a lot better. And I think once models are not having to be just, once the workload is not this general purpose training thing, but it's more the read, instead of read, write, it's kind of just express. I think it will be easier for silicon people to tune the architectures to do certain things. And so I think at that point, there's going to be flavors of GPUs with different architectures, with different kind of, I think probably data path bandwidth and things like that. So I do think the market's going to play out like that. I think NVIDIA is going to be in all of them, because they're really the center of the world for training. And I think people are using the general purpose stuff for inference now. But I think as variants come out, I'm pretty sure they'll be there too. But I think it's going to be them and AMD. That's my gut to start. And there's going to be there are many startups now trying to do that, do things in that layer.
Okay, I have a couple questions, but I'm going to ask just one, and it's about economic empowerment. And so, how do you see decentralization and blockchain helping to drive economic empowerment around the world?
So I think first of all, it's a natural, what I call, I guess the economic empowerment piece in a way is to me it's kind of either throwback or an anti-trend, because I think if you look at in my view, if you look at human history and how people worked, and there's arguments about how long humans have existed, but some will say it's like 400,000 years. Some will say 2 million, but like call it a few 100,000 years. If you think about the timeline of 400,000 years and what work looked like over that 400,000 year period for 399,930, it was decentralized. Kind of, like little work groups out in farms or, whatever it was. And some would argue, well, it wasn't that productive because, the Ford assembly line didn't exist. But it wasn't really until the physical industrial revolution that the style of work changed. And it's only been with us for about 50 years. Some would say 100, but call it 50. And if you think about the economy of probably your parents and maybe your grandparents, but maybe not, you went from kind of trade and agrarian and distributed work to being kind of dumbed down to just turn a crank on one bolt and do that 1,000 times a day on a factory line because there were machines to help you, right? So once there was an oil economy and machines and the efficiency in some ways of an industrial revolution, work really changed. But in a way, that was, I don't know if it was a one-time step function or a blip, right? Because if you think about what powers that, we've gone from an oil economy to an electron economy. And with the burning of oil and machines, you have that, old style physical stuff. Today, and I said that this morning too, if you had to give up this or oil, what would you keep? Everybody keep this, right? So all marginal productivity going forward is electrons. And so if you think about the nature of work, you're no longer a slave tied to a machine. You can be anywhere. And think about the number of people today that add GDP by sitting around pushing ones and zeros around on a screen. That could be anywhere, right? So I think we are witnessing as we speak, the decentralization of productivity if you're at a certain education level, right? So I think the fundamental nature of our economy and what our future looks like and what currencies will look like, because the oil, and we talked about this morning too, but the gold standard was a currency backed by an asset. And if you think about what is money, it's stored productivity, right? If you only work enough to eat for the day, you don't have excess. But if you have excess, you store that. And when that became an oil-based economy, nations had to preserve their economic future by hoarding oil. And you could say the US dollar is an ICO of oil barrels, right? So people hoard the dollars because the US and the British forced the Middle East to accept dollars, which may or may not be changing now, right? So as you shift to electrons, what happens? It's interesting, right? And if you think about the centralized companies from the 30s, really not 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, where your parents were like locked in a room with thousands of other people and promised a pension, those pensions don't exist, right? So a lot of that was a theoretical future built on the productivity it seemed for a while, and then people figured out, oh, that isn't the real reality, and the pension liability is bigger than what we have. So I think the distributed economic empowerment model is what humans were meant to operate to. Back there? Yeah, you.
One book has had the single most impact on the world.
A book?
Yeah.
Oh boy. I guess it's a bit. It was a bit after that. God, there's a cool book. It's not so. It's a little bit narrow. There's one called "Exploding the Phone," and it chronicles a lot of the movement around the 2600 hertz frequency, and the communities have built up around. So I don't know if you want to read about that, but that was a good book for me. Without that, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing. God, I'm sure there's other. I'll think of other ones maybe.
What do you think the value of protecting assets directly on chain is?
I think that's very, very valuable. But it's interesting because we've all been conditioned to work with banks for them to take care of it for us. So you got to be responsible, right? So I think it's wonderful. It's a wonderful thing to be able to have self-custody and your own control. It really is a wonderful thing. And it's interesting because I guess it could work in both a rule of law world or a Wild West world, but you really want the rule of law that protects you physically so that people don't come and kidnap you and take your shit. But I think it's a wonderful thing to have. I like that. Trying to think of other books, and I can't think of one. But anyway, I'm sorry. Oh yeah, that's true. Yeah, there was a book that back to economic empowerment. When I was running around Asia, setting up all these ISPs and then ultimately data centers, I stumbled across a book called "The Mystery of Capital" by an economist named Hernando de Soto, and because it was mind-blowing for me. Like when I was working on stuff in the early 90s in the Valley, you'd have a great idea, a great leader, get some money, and there were lots of people around that you could recruit, and they would, they'd go for the big idea. But when you would try to go and do this stuff in Southeast Asia, especially like setting up an internet thing, people that were seasoned executives that you knew could do the job, they'd look at you cross-eyed because it was like competing with the government because the government owned the phone companies, right? And it took me a while. I was like, wow, I feel like I'm competing with the power company or something like that. And he defines the basic building block of capitalism as title to land and a clarity of title to land. Because there's a lot of societies where you don't really know what you own. And if you don't have capital. Because if you're in a place where you have clear title to your land, you can take that title, mortgage it, get capital, build a cafe, and you start an economy. And Hernando de Soto is a fascinating character. I got him to come to a little summit I threw because it relates very much to blockchain. You know, so what is the definition of ownership? Where can you make it indelible? How do you make it low friction to access and visible everywhere when you want it to be? And yeah, and that book is fascinating because if you think about, yeah, and another side story, what happened with Hernando was Peru. He was a Peruvian economist. It's next to Colombia, and in the 70s or 60s and 70s, there was kind of a wave of socialism, communism. You know, some countries went communist, and Peru became a socialist economy, and nobody owned anything. So there's all this public land. And the Colombian drug dealers figured out that they could get all these Peruvian people to grow cocaine on public land. And that was their source. And so the Colombian drug lords made so much money that they ended up controlling 70% of the landmass of the country of Peru and had more weapons and a bigger army than the country of Peru. So the U.S. decides, because it's all coming to the USA, they want to stop that. So they set up a paramilitary operation in Nicaragua, which, if you remember the Oliver North thing, you know, Oliver North was in Nicaragua, and they spent $18 billion, I think, trying to fight off these drug lords. And here comes this roly-poly economist. He goes to the president of Peru, Alberto Fujimori, and he says, "I think I can stop this war." and the president's like, "Go for it. There's nothing I can do anymore." And so Hernando would literally walk into the jungles with these clipboards and these contracts, and he'd say, "Miss, I know you're going to deny that this green patch of cocaine is yours, but I'm going to cut you a deal. This paper basically says if you agree to never grow illegal crops on this land, you will have title to the land. It's yours." And so enough people signed up because they wanted to own the land that they eventually armed themselves and killed off the drug dealers because they wanted to own their land. And then the Peruvian economy took off, and it outgrew everything else in Latin America by 2 to 3 GDP points for a decade. So, and it was all because they had what they wanted, and they had the definition. And so he set up a paper titling system, and it's just like magic, you know. So, yeah. So it's an interesting read. That part is not detailed that well in there, but you can find other articles about why he wrote that book. Okay, last question. There's got to be one more. And if there aren't any more, I guess we're done. Thank you.